Nada po. Credits ka na. Pag-inikulang natin. Hindi na, sayang siya. Hindi na magiging.
This is the third video on Arduino-based smart cars. And so to get some history of how we got here, I'll invite you to look at those first two videos. The major change here was to drop the caster wheel and just rely on the two drive wheels. I robbed the old car to build pretty much everything you see in this car. So you're looking at the same LCD display, one of the same battery packs, and the same Leonardo, and the same MPU6050. Now if you're looking at this video, then you're probably already aware that there are many others who've already done projects similar to this. So I guess the new ad here is, can you use cheap Chinese gear motors that you find on eBay for about $2 a piece to build a balance bot? The short answer is, yes you can. And here's one way to do it. I started by building this simple frame from some scrap 5mm Luan that you can find at most any building supply store. In total there are 5 parts of the frame, but in my mind there's only 3 because the top and bottom shells are identical, as are the 2 sides. There are only 8 screws in the whole thing, 2 for each motor and 4 to hold the L289 dual H-Bridge in place. The wooden parts are all held together with Elmer's glue, and that's it. Most of the electronics and the battery boxes are held in place using double-sided foam tape. If you fool with RC planes, then you're already familiar with this kind of tape. If you haven't ever used it though, it's surprisingly strong stuff, and at the same time you can pull things up and relocate them without having to drill holes. Finally, after most of the wiring was complete, I fashioned 2 upper bumper guards by cutting 2 half-inch strips from an old 3M sanding pad and then held them in place through a combination of slotting the strips to mate with the upper shelf and of course some duct tape. The golden rule here is form follows function. Toward that end, the batteries were placed high on the cart, as was the 6050, which was shown in the sill shot, was placed on the underside of the upper shelf used to mount the Leonardo and LCD display. This gives the MPU a safe place to ride, and at the same time it can directly sense the one point on the car that you want to hold still. While we watch the car in action, I'll try to review some of the issues that I ran into in getting it to where we see it now. As said earlier, the car started life with a new frame, but with all the electrical components from the old 3-wheel platform. That included the 9-volt battery for electronics and the 5-volt 4-cell battery pack used to run the motors, and a 298 H-Bridge. It was hard to get good analytical data about what was going on with the car's performance. But to the eye, the motors were erratic in starting and overall anemic. Also, just locking one wheel down showed that the H-Bridge wasn't delivering power to each wheel as independently as expected. A review of the 298's data sheet showed no reason for it, nor did a Google search show that this was a common issue. So I ordered 2 more on the chance that mine was defective. In the meantime, I implemented code that added a second PID for yaw readings and reworked the motor deadband code. Also, the car was eating 9-volt batteries, so I ditched that in favor of a second 4-cell rechargeable pack, and rewired the system so it looked like a single 10-volt supply to run both the motors and logic. This had a double benefit by both reducing the deadband and giving the 6050 more range to work with. While the 10-volt motor drive was a definite improvement, the car still wouldn't balance, mainly due to the still erratic motor response. Fortunately, about this time the new H-bridges showed up, and because they were from a different source, I had to do some rewiring, mainly to accommodate the 2 extra N leads needed that I had earlier been able to avoid with the old H-bridge having its own hex inverter. But that was okay because I found out that the Arduino's analog pins can also be set up as digital pins, something I didn't know when I was setting up the earlier car. With the new L298 in place, the motors were now running as 2 separate units, but still the car wouldn't balance. To the eye it looked like at small angles there wasn't enough gain in the pitch PID, yet at the same time for large angles it would overreact. So to the pitch PID I added an if clause that basically boosts the gain of the proportional and differential constants for errors under a ½ degree. To be sure, that leaves you with a lot of parameters to set, but armed with this dual gain PID and some patience, a workable combination is found. Well, I think that about covers it for this round. Here's hoping that your next project, whatever it may be, returns as much satisfaction as this one did for me. And please, if I missed a point, don't hesitate to ask. This video is the 4th in a series on Arduino-based cars that I've built over the last few weeks. In the 3rd video, the car was using a 6050 MPU to allow it to balance on 2 wheels. This time, we'll build on that process by looking at 3 changes that have been made since then. First, what you see here is that same car fitted with a pair of N20 gear motors that can readily be found on eBay. Here's a quick preview of the car running on the N20 wheel set. Later, we'll take a closer look at them, but first I want to take you through a speeded up version of the mechanics in changing over from one wheel set to the other. In this case, we're going from the N20s back to the yellow drive set used in the earlier videos. In real time, this takes about 10 minutes. Here we see it in less than 1. The real takeaway in this clip is that they are interchangeable, and it gives a simple way to compare the performance of the 2 wheel sets. Now that that's complete, let's take a closer look at the original wheels in action. And while we watch, I'll go over the second change made to this version of the car. To do that, let's review how the earlier version worked. Basically, in the balance department, there are 2 separate PID routines that translate pitch and yaw changes derived from the MPU into values that could be summed together and ultimately be used as H-bridge PWM signals. That by itself worked well enough to balance the car, but in that version it would pretty quickly wander off in one direction or the other. To prove it, go back and watch the previous video and note how often the car was picked up and set back into frame. This was due mainly to using a fixed balance point that was never quite correct, plus running the car on a surface that wasn't perfectly level. To counteract that issue, I added a routine that would continuously recalculate the car's balance point. It does this by assuming that if the set point isn't correct, the car's motors will run more in one direction than the other. So basically, after 30 pitch PID operations have transpired, the new routine finds the average of its contribution to the speed signal, and then from that generates a correction to the balance set point. Additionally, this average gets added to what I think of as an all-time running error. That also contributes to the balance point setting. The idea here being that if the car hasn't moved at all, then the sum found in this bucket would be 0. If, on the other hand, it's moved either forward or backward, then this error bucket would have a non-zero value, and that value is fairly proportional to the net distance traveled by the car. For sure, this won't have the accuracy of a digital wheel encoders, but it doesn't require any additional hardware, which particularly for the N20 wheels would be hard to do. And if done correctly, surely will be better than no compensation at all. While describing how the new auto balance point and position compensation code works, the video has moved on to showing that same functionality using the N20 wheel set. The code is the same for both wheel sets, only the PID constants have been changed. For the lower powered, slower turning N20 wheels, these constants are larger. Now, let's have a look topside and see what's going on with the display, which is the third change in the car. I apologize for the jerky camera holding, as I know it makes it hard to watch, and I'll ask you to trust me that in real life this display is much easier to read than it appears here. Basically, while the car is in motion, the display shows 4 pieces of data. The first, labeled SPD, or speed, is the last 30 cycle PWM average. It's an integer and has a theoretical range of plus or minus 0 to 255. To its right is the ERR, or error reading, which I previously referred to as the all-time running error. It can be any integer value, but remember 0 is considered to be ideal. On the bottom row is the BPT balance point reading, and like all the other readings is shown as an integer, but should be interpreted as a decimal value of degrees out to the 100th position. It's the set point that the pitch PID would see as needing 0 correction. And finally, to its right is the Y, or yaw reading in degrees. It's updated once per second, while the other 3 are updated every 3/4 of a second. The other thing about this car's display that needs pointing out is that in the previous versions of the car, the LCD 4-bit mod library was used. This was driven mostly by my having selected a SandSmart display and then looking to their website for examples of how to use it. But because PID refresh rates are critical to making a car like this work, I quickly learned that updating the display was getting in the way. Depending on which character positions were involved, it would take anywhere from 25 to 125 milliseconds to do it. I Googled for solutions, but couldn't find that anybody had found issues with this. So it was mostly by accident that I found that using the liquid crystal library alone yielded 4 millisecond processing times, irrespective of which portion of the display was being updated. From the perspective of using the display, this was a major find. As shown in these clips, the car has been running in what I call the figure 8 mode, which is a carryover designation from the original car that started this series. But what's happening in this case is concurrent with the yaw display update, and if the car's all-time error reading is within 30, meaning it's close to its home position, it will either advance or retard the yaw setting by 15 degrees. It will do so until it reaches a maximum of plus 180 degrees. If it's retarding the heading, it does that until it hits minus 180. So, in an ideal setting, the car would rotate clockwise for 360 degrees, then reverse itself, and then rotate counterclockwise until pointing the same way, at the rate of 15 degrees per second. In reality, because it's often not within 30 units of home, the effective spin rate is considerably slower. But I think it does demonstrate that the car's heading can be controlled while at the same time maintaining its balance. Finally, you might ask, which wheel set makes the better balance pod? Clearly both are usable. Personally, from an aesthetics point of view, I lean toward the N20s, and they consume probably 1/3 of the power, so batteries last longer. But they're not near as powerful as the cheaper yellow set, and I think take more finesse to fit to a car. Their having an open frame can be viewed as both a plus or negative. Plus if you like to see moving parts, but negative if dirt or lint might be a factor. The yellow plastic motors are easier to mount and can be had for probably half the cost or even less when you add in wheels and other related mounting hardware. The yellow set will allow you to run the car over a wider range of terrain, so I think it's really a toss-up and should be your call as to which is best. Well, that's all for now, and as always, good luck with your next project.